hand it over to Vivek Ponnada. Did I get that right?
You did. Hey, Johnny. Thanks a lot.
Cool. Hey, Vivek.
Hey, Vivek.
All right. So hopefully you're able to see my screen. Okay. So just a little bit about me. My background has always been in industrial controls. I've been doing OT security for the past 8 years or so. Electrical engineering. I have an MBA in finance and a SANS cert in industrial control security. Currently, I work for ICI Electrical Engineering. My past roles, I was with GE. I worked a lot with turbines, like you mentioned. Control systems for turbines was my background for quite some time. I'm also the co-lead for the Top 20 Secure PLC Coding Practices project. And you'll see this in industrial controls quite a bit. Most people have traveled quite a bit around the world. So those of you that haven't considered joining industrial control security, highly recommend it. There will be an after times, hopefully with COVID, and then you'll get to travel quite a bit around the world. My contact info is here. And just a little bit more personal stuff. When the weather is warm and nice, I like to do these two things. When it's not so nice, I like to do this thing. However, this is how my backyard looked like yesterday. So right now, it's a lot more convenient and enjoyable being in front of you folks than doing anything outside at 15F. All right, so OT, amped up attention, right? So we've all heard all these kind of news bits and media articles this past year. So back in May, Colonial Pipeline, and then in June, JBS, and then in July, this healthcare, UVM ransomware attack, and then of course, Mandiant, which is an incident response company, talked about how actors are aggressively pursuing healthcare targets, even though we're in the middle of the worst pandemic we can imagine, right? And then back in February, y'all remember not just ransomware, but this incident at Oldsmar, Florida with insecure remote access. Now, I'm gonna not list all the things that happened, right? So these are just some highlights, but the key is, unless you've been living on a rock, you're probably thinking, man, there's so much going on in OT, a lot of attacks happening. Are we at risk for critical infrastructure? Or on the other hand, maybe you're thinking, man, with all this news, maybe we should do something really quickly. Maybe the governments are thinking, let's do something about it. But I want to quote Ralph Langner here. He's the guy that discovered and decoded Stuxnet, so if that means something to you. He said, wake-up calls don't change a thing. Wake-up calls are irrelevant. He said this in 2018 after many years of pursuing. He mentioned, there's a talk on S4 2018 where he mentioned, he's been chasing, congressmen, government officials and industry leaders in doing something about OT security, but the pace has been much slower than he expected back in the 2009-2010 time period. So that you should remember that nothing moves really fast in the OT world. It's also confusing for onlookers, right? You hear these two terms, IT-OT divide, and you also hear IT-OT convergence. And for someone that's not deeply embedded in OT, it is very confusing. Are we saying IT and OT are very divided, but somehow they're also converging? So the IT-OT divide, and here I mentioned this, Drago's article where they mentioned that the cultural divide between IT and OT blocks 65% of the organizations from having a unified cybersecurity strategy. I mean, no matter how deep you are in OT or not, this sounds bad, right? That somehow companies are not able to provide a coherent strategy because of this divide. And there is a reason for that. So the IT people historically have focused on information, right? So the CIA triad, we all know, confidentiality, integrity, availability, that's the focus on IT security, or focus for IT security. However, for the OT people historically, or industrial controls in general, there is another triad called SRP, which is safety, reliability, and productivity, or some people might use efficiency here. Either way, because the focus is on different things, of course there's a cultural divide. It's not that hard to imagine why, right? Because if you're focused on information, you focus on this. If you focus on plant operation and safety and reliability, you obviously would have different priorities. So that's why the cultural divide exists, okay? Then on this side, IT-OT convergence. You obviously will hear a lot about digital transformation, Industry 4.0. I don't mean to throw jargon at you, but or the latest and greatest, whatever buzzwords. The key is if you talk to any of these consultants or any of the IT security folks that are helping manufacturing move forward, smart manufacturing, digital manufacturing, there's a lot of convergence because the technologies are so similar. Whatever is being used in OT and whatever is being used in IT are so similar. In fact, I quote Rob Lee. He's a senior science instructor and a co-founder of Dragos. He mentioned this: technology conversions happened a long time ago, but the missions will remain different, right? Because the focus, again, the mission for OT people is this SRP triad. So even if the technology convergence happened for the most part in OT at Purdue Level 2, for example, or going forward in IoT and manufacturing or anything that you can imagine, the mission will remain different for the OT people. Okay, so that's why it's a little confusing for folks that are coming from outside. Now, what exactly is OT? Well, let's ask this question taking a step back, right? I'm sure in this traditional Purdue model, you'll see this neat little segmentation. You got this level 0 devices, you got the controllers at level 1, the HMIs and local control operating stations at level 2, and you all are very familiar with it. The thing is, you will not find a single plant in the whole planet that is so neatly segmented like this, right? This is just a model that is useful. However, it's not entirely accurate, not entirely relevant for each site, because there are many other things that are not probably represented or represented correctly for that site, right? So as an example, the traditional Purdue model doesn't talk about cloud services. And these days, with all the optimization analytics, there might be some kind of tentacles from a cloud service provider all the way back to, level 3, maybe even level 2, and maybe some sensors, the IoT or the industrial IoT, devices that are sensors, and then again, some kind of cloud connectivity all the way back to level 0 or level 1. So those things are not represented here, right? In fact, if you go to this webpage, you'll see that there is a discussion about if this Purdue model is dead, and an alternative pictorial showing, what other things would be considered relevant along with the traditional Purdue model. It's not dead, but it's not entirely accurate for, each of the sites that you would work with, right? So here I quote Patrick Miller, again, another luminary. I like to do this on these slides because I want you all to think about this and then go find them on Twitter or on YouTube, because they have amazing content out there, very useful. These are all OT luminaries, right? He said, we've always characterized security in terms of OT and IT, but going forward, it's just T, right? That's because you see all this technology here, most of this is now Windows-based. So if you're coming from IT, historically, maybe 20 years ago, maybe the devices that you found here were proprietary and maybe things that you didn't understand, but a lot of IT people now will be very familiar with all the hardware here. So it's not as different as it used to be, right? So a lot more unifying concepts and technologies these days. That's again the convergence. Now, growing pains, right? What we hear about an incident or after an incident is our OT systems weren't affected. In fact, we heard this clearly, loud and clear, after Colonial, where they mentioned they shut down the operation of the pipelines. However, they said only the IT systems were affected and the OT systems were not affected. Like it matters, right? And we'll come to that in a second. We also hear we're air gapped, or we were air gapped. I mean, most people, especially in OT, that talk about air gap actually have never seen an air gap. They probably heard this term from someone in the military, or maybe applied this in the military in some context, and now use it, misconstrue it as to what that means. Most OT systems are very connected. In fact, with convergence, with all the network integration that we have, there are very few places that are truly air gapped. We also hear about the rules. We follow all the regulations and rules, and most times it's in the context of NERC in power in the US, for example, or some kind of security management system in the ISO context. However, as we all know, compliance doesn't mean security, right? Not always, for sure. And then this is my favorite. We take security seriously. This is no different from, web apps saying we take your privacy seriously. Whenever someone says that, you typically want to run away because you know for a fact that they actually don't, right? So the real questions to be asked are, did the incident really impact the organization's primary business objective? I mean, this is the key, right? So the Colonial Pipeline was not able to operate. That's all matters. Whether the systems that were affected were IT systems or OT systems, it is important for people that are remediating it, but it's not important for the average outsider. What's important is to answer this question. And is there an RTO, the recovery time objective? Like, how long did you expect to be down, and how long will you be down before you plan to come back up? Or did you have a plan, right? And was there any unacceptable impact on personnel, health, safety, and environment? I mean, HSE, or safety, environment, and health, this has been critical for OT, industrial control systems, for a long time. 30 plus years, if not forever, because we had OSHA and all these rules in the past few decades, right? And here I quote Sarah Flukes, who's my co-lead for the Top 20 Secure PLC Coding Practices project. She says, security and safety have the common objective of making systems more resilient. And this resiliency, you hear this term quite a bit in industrial controls, that is key. If you have a resilience plan, or if you have a resilience structure in place, you'll be able to come back up. And most of these places do have a plan, right? They might have a plan for emergency preparedness. They might have a plan for something going wrong with the equipment. They might not have a plan for cyber-related activities, and we'll talk about that for sure. However, you can improve the security aspect of an OT system or an OT context by talking about safety, because safety and security have the same objectives. The methodologies in getting to where you want to be is different, but the concept and the goals are very similar. Now, bad news isn't always bad, folks, and this is where I'm so excited to be in OT. Granted, I'm biased because I've always been in industrial controls and OT has been my background, but those of you that are considering new or recently moved into OT, this is probably the best time to be in OT, right? So just a little bit of history lesson on the left. Historically, the upgrades in ICS and OT systems were primarily capital expenditures. So 25 years was not unheard of, right? Every 20, 25 years, you would have investments. You put together a few $1 million project and you upgrade either a plant or a site or maybe a whole complex. And you then, leverage it for the next 20, 25 years. There was very little annual maintenance plan, maybe budget-wise, right? So you would still do annual maintenance, but very little expenditure plan for the rest of the cycle, because that's how you did it, right? That was the history. And the engineers that were coding in the ICS world, they were trained in process controls and safety, not necessarily security, because that wasn't something that was important for them back in the day or important for anyone else, right? And the OT solutions, they had limited support in actually making a secure solution possible. For example, the encryption and authentication were missing at level 0 and level 1 in the Purdue model. Vendors wouldn't support all the hardware that was secure. So one vendor might say, we only tested our solution with this Fortinet switch and not the other Cisco switch. Another vendor might say the opposite, right? So if you wanted to implement something that's secure based on your risk assessment, maybe that wasn't supported. And then patching works very differently in OT to a certain extent even today, but historically very much so. Limited patch windows, right? You can only take an outage in a plant every so often, maybe once a year. In a power plant, once every few years in a refinery. So you don't want to take any other outage because that's tied to revenue. And then installing a patch might break functionality, which again, loss of view, loss of functionality, and nobody wants that. And then the patch might not be available, and if available, it might not have been tested properly. Again, ties back to breaking functionality. And then this is very uniquely OT, folks. Patch might not reduce risk. I mean, again, this is historical, but it's true to a certain extent today as well, because if you didn't have encryption and authentication at this level 0 and 1, what difference does it make if you patch a level 2 HMI, but you're still able to send commands to level 0 and 1? Let's say someone got unauthorized access because of credential stuffing or insecure remote access. This patch itself, by itself, could not have mitigated the risk, because that's, you're still able to send commands to the PLC and take over, right? And then asset inventory didn't exist. I mean, I've never seen a good asset inventory existing a few years ago. Most of the places would have a Visio or a CAD diagram or a PDF that's very static. It doesn't really show exactly what's in the plan, right? And if you didn't know what you have in the plan, and how do you protect it? Now, like I mentioned, the exciting piece, right? Things have changed. So risk-based investments are happening. A lot of places have considered OPEX. You are seeing annual maintenance, whether it's for a patch management program or some kind of vulnerability assessment program. You're seeing that OPEX kind of investment. Security awareness is increasing at all levels, folks, not just at the engineers, not just the users. Management is asking questions. The boards are asking questions. The government, regional and federal, everywhere you're seeing this awareness increasing. And most new platforms do have security features, level 0, level 1, level 2. They all have, a lot of security features that the key there is to actually use them and implement them properly. And then secure protocols, this was an issue back in the day at level 0 and 1. Now we do have protocols that you can, again, leverage better communication options with encryption that's available. Virtualization, I mean, this is a big deal. A few years ago, it was very hard to find a virtualized HMI, but now you have it. In fact, even PLCs are being virtualized, so we're getting a lot more support that way. It really helps in patch management if everything is virtualized, right? And then asset inventory and asset management solutions. We now have multiple vendors that are competing in this space and able to provide you this asset inventory and asset management options. In fact, Dale Peterson, who puts together the S4 conference every year, is again one of the luminaries of this OT space. He mentioned, regarding OT security companies, that profit does not appear to be an issue in OT security, as it hasn't been in much of IT security, because there's a lot of growth. A lot of these solutions are coming from these, relatively newer companies that are just accelerating at a phenomenal pace. Now, the landscape is evolving. There are a lot of regulations and directives being thrown, whether it's the TSA directives after the Colonial Pipeline incident, or the emergency directives, or CISA's guidance. There is so much going on in terms of, asking for access controls, improving accountability, finding a person that is responsible for both reporting things as well as, getting things done, right? And then this push towards network monitoring and logging, so that, if something were to happen at a particular site or a particular industry, that the rest of the folks can, do something about it, right? Learn from it. Standards too, I didn't put everything in there, but the ICI 62443 is now considered a horizontal standard. It's being applied in everything from transportation, oil and gas, power, healthcare. So we now have common standards across OT that you can leverage. Of course, the CSF from NIST, again, this is widely used. We'll talk a little bit about the some of the functions in Detect in a little bit. But then we also have some cool practices. The CCE methodology from INL, the consequence-driven cyber-informed engineering, kind of highlights the fact that in OT space, it's not all about appending safety or security after the fact, but incorporating security as part of your risk assessment, as part of your engineering, to actually engineer a secure solution, right? You also have cyber PHA, which is a process hazard analysis combined with cyber, so that you can leverage existing PHA that you've done for safety, right? And then add cyber to it, so that you're doing it as part of your plant risk assessment. And then I'm part of the secure PLC coding practices, again, trying to improve coding practices for controllers at level 1. So this is cool, right? Like, you have so many new things happening. Again, at a pace maybe that's more OT-like, it's not a galactical pace, but still, compared to what was 10 years ago, and at quite a bit faster pace than other people expect. And then we also have, if you're a defender, you have a lot more threat intel products now available, customized for OT, a lot of visibility tools, anomaly detection. We also have MITRE ATT&CK for ICS framework, right? And then the ICS kill chain. A lot of research being done on SBOM, so that, both vendors and integrators are now, they're expecting regulations to come in, but more importantly, they want to track better, right, compared to what they, were doing before. So a lot of investment, a lot of research going on in SBOMs, even in the OT space. And then, of course, ICS for ICS. This stands for Instant Command System for Industrial Control Systems. And Megan Sanford, who leads this effort, her statement here: for many years, we've needed ICS for ICS to enable collectively organized cyber and physical responses in a unified way. Because in the industrial controls world, we can deal with physical responses. We deal with them all the time. When something happens, like a refinery fire, or in the Gulf of Mexico, maybe there's a hurricane. We've had plans to deal with this for a long time. So security can be added to that planning so that it's now part of what we do, right? That way it's not really something strange, but something that we do, right? Now, low-hanging fruit. I mean, this is another interesting piece of the puzzle. In the IT world, these are done, right? So these are clearly very basic, and maybe you would have already done it a long time ago. However, in the OT world, we still have them as a low-hanging fruit. So a lot of places don't have access and authentication controls. MFA is not implemented. For example, that Oldsmar, Florida instance, insecure remote access and no MFA. So pretty straightforward credential stuffing situation. Boom, somebody has access, right? It's not that difficult to pwn a system that is vulnerable to basic stuff that basic stuff is missing. Similarly, in policies and procedures, removable media usage, goes back to Stuxnet world. Things have improved, but it's still pretty common to see, no removable media policies or enforcements, and no logging, right? So no records of things happening. So how do you do incident response when you don't know what happened, right? If you don't have any logs or alerts, then it's pretty hard. So these things can be incorporated pretty easily, right? And then there are things that we can do in OT that are not typically easy in IT. So whitelisting, for example, is so much easier in OT because we know exactly what needs to work and what it takes for the HMI or which device to communicate to that PLC, and we can whitelist that. And it becomes very difficult if the app is not on whitelisted. It adds a layer of complexity to the attack if someone was targeting you. But in the IT world, this is a difficult task, right? Similarly, network segmentation and controls, whether you use a zone and conduit model or some other model, it's a lot easier to segment the networks in OT and manage them with the appropriate risk because these networks are relatively static compared to all the chatter that you see in the IT world. And then this is another very interesting thing in OT. Risk reduction, as we all know, risk equals what? Likelihood times impact or consequence. And instead of just focusing on the likelihood in the OT space, you can actually maybe more easily reduce the risk by reducing the consequence or reducing the impact of an event versus focusing on the likelihood that might be super expensive. And we'll talk a little bit more about it in a second. But again, here I quote Leslie Carhart. She does a lot of incident response. She said, maybe your users aren't the weakest link in security. Maybe you are the weakest link in enabling your users to do their mission security. So if you're coming across these basics missing in action, ask yourself if you're a security person or an IT person helping your OT fellows as to why it is, right? Why are these things missing, and how can we get over that hump? Maybe we can help them. So who is affected? So this, again, unlike in IT where maybe it's just an individual or a group of individuals getting affected, in the OT space, because of the critical infrastructure and the components, there are many, many people affected very differently. So within the organizations, management, employees, and customers who are different in many cases with consumers and users. Think again, Colonial Pipeline. The customers for Colonial Pipeline might be the Valeros or another refineries of the world, but the users are the end users, right? So these are the people that are buying gasoline. So customers are not necessarily users in critical infrastructure. So you might have these problems with the organizations. However, for the users, maybe price and resource availability, those are maybe, more of an issue, right? And of course, governments, whenever something happens, whether it's because of cyber or something else, think about the Texas, back in February, the grid relatively unstable situation for a few days. People died. which was very sad. And then a lot of people didn't have power for quite some time. And so you might have civil unrest, we'll have cascading effects on the economy, besides, of course, political adversaries trying to leverage the situation. So if your grid, for example, is in that marginal state of collapse, if you're that close to collapse, maybe a cyber incident can put it over, right? So there are things that OT security has to deal with that maybe IT security didn't have to. And of course, media, a lot of sensationalism. I mean, every time there's an OT related item or maybe an insecure remote access, they start with Stuxnet. I mean, it's like this classic bingo, right? That you can check off. Why? Like, we just want to know what happened and no confusion. We don't want anyone to say a sophisticated cyber attack, happened. No, insecure remote access is not sophisticated. Insecure remote access has nothing to do with Stuxnet, right? But it's hardly ever reported correctly, so something to keep in mind. And then experts, and it's not that difficult to find different opinions, even though they're all well intended. I use a few examples here. If you're arguing about GNU and Linux being different, if you're arguing about Linux being a kernel versus an operating system, those are for the experts. The average user doesn't care, right? So they just want to use an operating system. For them, Linux means all of it, right? Similarly, these experts sometimes will give you opinions that are not intended for the general audience, but then the media, takes and runs with it and then adds to more confusion. And then, of course, vendors and consultants, we talk about how they're growing fast, but sometimes it's horse before the cart. If you're selling a detection product or if you're selling incident response, but they don't have asset inventory, then, it's horse before the cart. Insurance providers sometimes are pushing for best practices, otherwise they're not, insuring, and sometimes they're excluding OT because they don't know how to deal with it, right? Sarah Freeman, who co-authored the CCE book, actually mentions this. We need to change how people think about managing security, and it's true because OT security, especially, has to be managed in an engineering fashion, not necessarily the same as IT, right? Let's go a little faster into the last couple of slides. Quick reality check. I mean, I mentioned it's an exciting time to be in OT, but OT is a vague term, but cyber physical technology are pervasive, right? So they're all over the place, but the different verticals leads to, different compliance regimens, different requirements, and different impacts. What happens if a power plant comes down is very different from what happens when a pipeline comes down. So not all OT is the same, right? A lot of common work being done, like I mentioned before, with the standards and the regulations. But OT is different in IT to IT in many ways. So many security solutions need to be maybe customized or maybe implemented uniquely, but not everything has to be new, right? So there are some proven IT solutions that we can fit or adapt instead of reinventing the wheel for OT. And in other times, we can just use an extension of process safety or emergency preparedness, whether it's with the cyber PHA or the ICS for ICS, to improve OT security versus having to do something new. Right? And then it's meaningless for organizations to focus on OT risk and IT risk separately, because what matters is business risk, whether it's from OT or IT. And then ransomware just affecting IT systems, or someone saying, oh, these OT systems were not attacked. It's not relevant, right? The key is if the business can't function due to an incident, then that's your problem, right? That's the business problem. So here I quote Daniel, who mentions not compromising security requirements when making purchasing decisions. Again, if you just do what you did 20 years ago in the OT space, bought the same kind of equipment, wanted the same functionality, and just have this tunnel vision, then you're going to miss the point about improving OT security in the 20th and 21st century, and do what is required, right? And then we still have a few open questions, right? Especially if you don't have compliance requirements, or if you only have directives, whether it's in healthcare or in pipelines or in water, for example, wastewater, where there are no compliance requirements, or not as many as in the power sector in the US, for example. Where do you start, right? You start with personnel and training. I mean, this is the first and foremost thing. Like, you train your OT people, if you train your ICS people, that's the best bang for your buck when you're beginning your program, right? And then you identify in this, NIST CSF that I mentioned, there are many things that you can do, but start with identifying your asset inventory, do a risk assessment of where you are so you can track your maturity over time. And then leverage industry groups, obviously the water associations, the water ISACs of the world for water industry, similarly for oil and gas. There is an ISAC these days for every critical infrastructure, or you can cross collaborate with other ISACs. And of course, CISA in the US, and I'm in Vancouver, Canada. We have our equivalent cyber security center. Governments are, providing a lot of information that you can leverage. Establish a disaster recovery policy and the recovery time objectives so that you can then track if you're able to meet your goals or not. Like if you don't have a goal, if you don't have a destination in mind, you'll never get there, right? And do a tabletop exercise or incident response exercise to actually check and make sure that your backups are working or if you're able to meet your RTO. Obviously, you can never, especially in the OT world, you cannot outsource incident response 100%. There's no way, because those people need to be aware of your plant, your situation, your network, and only your people can be, right? So you can have a retainer with a third party, but you have to be part of that IR. And then post-incident, obviously, you need to have a trigger that says, yep, this is an incident, we have to do something about it. But then there are other open questions, to pay or not to pay. Some countries are actually making it illegal to pay ransom. And even if you paid and you got the recovery key, let's say, there's no guarantee that it'll work. And even if that works, the data recovery might take much longer than your RTO, right? So if it's not reasonable, then, what's the point? Why pay? Because you should have other plans, other mitigation in place, because your RTO is much lower and you'll not be able to come back up in this reasonable time period. So here I quote Maggie Morganti. She says, security of ICS has global effects and requires a global security mindset. Here she's talking about security vendors and integrators with this, global reach, right? Products that go around the world. Because yes, whether you're Siemens or GE or Schneider Electric or any of these big companies that have products embedded in OT systems around the world, it is a global issue, right? If something were to happen in one country and then cascading effects happen in other countries because of critical infrastructure failures, that's a problem for everybody. So that's all I have, folks. I am happy to take any questions if you have. I just put the summary here so that, hopefully I answered most of the items that I mentioned in the summary, but happy to answer any questions.